Yeah. Okay, good evening, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining in. I'm Dr. Anandhanidhar from Ambedkar University, Delhi in India. I'm the co-convener of the Critical Childhoods and Youth Studies Collective, along with Dr. Divya Kannan from Srinagar University. And we welcome you all to our second book series event, new book series event. We're very glad to have all of you with us. I'm sorry for my voice. We're suffering from terrible pollution and change of season in Delhi. So for today, I would like to just, before I begin to introduce the event, share that we're recording this event and we will be using the recording to circulate with our members in CCYSC. And the author of the book will also be using this recording. So today's event is about a newly published book titled Problematizing Law, Rights and Childhood in Israel, Palestine. It's been published by Cambridge University Press, and it offers unique insights into the ever-tightening relationship between law, children's rights, and state violence at both the local and global levels. The author, Hedi Viterbo, Dr. Viterbo is a senior lecturer, associate professor in law at Queen's Mary University, London. Previously, he was a lecturer in law at the University of Essex and has been a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. He has received his PhD from LSE and an LLM from Tel Aviv University. Today, for the very interesting book launch and book discussion, we have discussants such as Dr. Karen Wells, Rachel Rosen, and Kristen Cheney. And Dr. Kristen Cheney will also introduce to us the speakers for the event and how the flow of the event will go. Just to briefly introduce Dr. Cheney, and before I give her the floor, I'd like to share that Dr. Cheney works primarily with children's survival strategies amidst difficult circumstances and the politics of humanitarian intervention for such children, mainly in the East and Southern African context. She has published 3 books, including a most recent edited collection titled Disadvantaged Childhoods and Humanitarian Intervention, co-authored with Aviva Sinervo, published by Paul Greve Macmillan, and she has 2 other very interesting books focused on African orphanage and the Ugandan national development processes through children, and she's looked at the question of child citizens in that book. Dr. Cheney is an associate professor of at the International Institute of Social Studies. I open the floor to Kristen Cheney. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and to be part of this discussion, and very proud of Hedi for his new book. Very much looking forward to the reflections also of Karen and Rachel. Let me give you a little bit of background about them now that Dini has told you a little about my background as well as Hedi's. Karen Wells is a professor of human geography at Birkbeck, University of London. She's published widely on the impact of international public economy on children and childhood, as well as on visual cultures of childhood. Among her publications are 3 monographs: Childhood in a Global Perspective, which is by Polity Press. The 3rd edition is out in 2021. And she's also written Childhood Studies, Making Young Subjects. That was published by Polity in 2017. And a book called Visual Cultures of Childhood by Rauman and Little in 2020. Those are the most recent, as well as an edited collection, Childhood, Youth, and Violence in Global Contexts from Paul Greve Macmillan in 2014. So welcome, Karen. We look forward to your reflections on Hedi's work. Rachel Rosen is an associate professor at the UCL Institute of Education, University College London. Her work is located at the intersections of sociology of childhood and materialist feminist thought, with a focus on unequal childhoods, migration, and stratified social reproduction. She's co-author of Negotiating Adult-Child Relationships and Early Childhood Research, published by Routledge in 2013, and co-editor of two collections, Reimagining Childhood Studies, Bloomsbury Press, 2018, and Feminism and the Politics of Childhood from the UCL Press in 2018. And I'm very honored to also have chapters in both of those edited volumes. And as Anandini mentioned, I'm Kristen Cheney, Associate Professor of Child and Youth Studies at the ISS in The Hague. I will next academic year, however, be taking up the position of Director of the School of Child and Youth Care at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. So you can find me there as of next year. For the event, what we will do first is allow Hedi to give us an outline of the main themes and arguments of his book. And that will help our audience who won't have read the book to understand and contextualize the discussants' comments. So we'll give Karen and Rachel each some time. Mohammed Ratzi was advertised also as being a discussant, but wasn't able to join us due to illness. So that's unfortunate, but actually it will give us a little more time for audience participation. So if you do have questions at that time, we can have you utilize some of the Zoom features like raising your hand and or putting some questions in the text, and I will moderate that discussion. So without further ado, perhaps Hedi, we turn it over to you and let you introduce your book.
Thank you very much, Kristen. So before I start, I should first of all thank the CCYSC for hosting us, and especially to Anandini and Divya. Thank you very much. And thank you, Kristen, for chairing the panel. And I'm extremely fortunate to have these outstanding discussants, both Rachel and Karen. As you mentioned, unfortunately, Mohammed couldn't be with us, but we all wish him a speedy recovery. So the book is the culmination of 14 years of research, and the title is Problematizing Law, Rights and Childhood in Israel-Palestine. So as the title indicates, what the book offers is a rethinking of childhood, law, human rights, and state violence, both in and beyond the context of Israel-Palestine. And the book takes an interdisciplinary perspective, which combines insights from critical childhood studies, critical legal theory, and critical literature on human rights. The book is also based on hundreds of sources, many of which are not publicly available. And I can elaborate later if anyone's interested. Now, if we define a child as anyone under the age of 18, then half of the population in Palestine are children. And part of what the book does is examine discourses, practices, and representations that relate to this young half of the population. But the book also looks at childhood as a broader category, which applies to people of all ages, and I'll return to this point soon. So in the short time I have, I'll touch on three central themes of the book. And because this event has to do with childhood studies, I'll also focus primarily on childhood. So one of the central arguments of the book is about the relationship between state violence, international law, and children's rights. Critics of Israel often claim that it simply disregards international law and human rights. But this couldn't be further from the truth. What Israel actually does is increasingly use international law and child rights to perfect and legitimize its oppression of Palestinians. And Israel presents much of this as serving the best interests of the child. So for example, Israel has been using the language of child rights and international law to justify its military offensives and closure of the Gaza Strip. One of the reasons for this is that both law and human rights are inherently open to competing uses and competing interpretations. And what this means is that they can easily lend themselves to state actors who use them to launder their actions. In addition, law and human rights also rest on certain generalizations and abstractions. As a result, they're often applied without sufficient sensitivity to the context at hand. Children's rights are premised on a specific abstraction, which is a supposedly natural and universal model of childhood. But in reality, this model of childhood often marginalizes children, and it also paves the way for apathy and harshness towards adults. These problems are not entirely unique to Israel-Palestine, and in some of my previous work, I've written about how law contributes to torture in other parts of the world. And some of my other publications examined how the oppression of indigenous communities and ethnic minorities, especially in North America, Australia, and China, have been presented as child protection measures. So in the new book, I draw on this earlier work and I also develop it further. At the same time, if law, rights, and childhood are open to competing uses, this means that they can also be used to resist state violence. And one of the things the book does is bring to light various forms of Palestinian resistance. For example, I show how Palestinians lie to Israeli authorities about their age in order to circumvent travel restrictions that are based on age. And I can provide further examples later. A second theme of the book has to do with the human rights community, including NGOs, UN bodies, and scholars. The book shows how they not only fail to realize the harm that the child rights framework often does to Palestinians, but they themselves also contribute to this harm. For example, the book shows how human rights actors have repeatedly pushed for reforms concerning Palestinian children in Israeli custody. Eventually, Israel implemented these reforms, and now Israel keeps citing the reforms as proof, supposedly, that it respects international standards of children's rights. But the truth is that some reforms have made no real difference, while other reforms actually harmed both Palestinian children and adults. And I can say more about this later if anyone's interested. So the book identifies various reasons for this problem. One reason is that human rights actors conceptualize childhood in simplistic, romanticized, and essentializing terms. Another reason is that the human rights community tends to embrace international law uncritically without considering its limitations and its pitfalls. Another reason is that human rights organizations sometimes either misunderstand or are ignorant of crucial legal facts. Another reason is that the human rights community often views the political situation through the lens of mental health, which sometimes pathologizes Palestinians and individualizes the issues that they face. And another reason, is that human rights organizations claim to represent children's voices, but in reality they often misrepresent, overlook, or even act against what children tell them. And another reason is the need of human rights organizations to keep donors and lay audiences interested in issues that are both complex and contentious. And another reason is that these organizations often frame human rights violations in isolation from their structural political causes. So as you can see, the list is quite long. In fact, the human rights community has much more in common with Israeli authorities than is generally believed. On the one hand, Israel has been increasingly embracing the language of human rights, as I've mentioned. On the other hand, some human rights actors emulate or even endorse the Israeli depiction of Palestinians as a security threat. Another commonality is that both Israel and the human rights community use age distinctions as tools of governance. which leads me to the third and last theme that I'd like to discuss, which concerns the operation of both childhood and age as modes of control. For example, the book examines how age distinctions are used as biopolitical tools and also as risk management tools. And I explore this issue across a broad range of contexts, such as mass surveillance, restrictions on family contact, travel restrictions, prison regulations, and restrictions on the supply of food to Palestinians. One of the things the book explores in this regard is how Israel disciplines and punishes Palestinian adults through their young. And I'm not only talking about adults who have some responsibility for children, such as parents, teachers, or social workers. These are the adults that are usually mentioned in childhood studies and children's rights scholarship. What the book shows is that discourses and practices that are seemingly focused on children also affect other adults. For example, they inform the treatment of Palestinian adults in Israeli prisons, or the targeting of Palestinian adults in Israeli airstrikes. But discourses about childhood are also concerned with Israeli adults. An example is Israeli soldiers who abuse or kill Palestinian children. The book looks at how these soldiers are themselves described by Israel as both children and victims. So there's much more that can be said, but I'll stop here, and thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing what Rachel and Karen have to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Hedi. Those are very provocative points, and I hope we will have productive discussion about that. I would like to invite Karen to give her comments.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that whistle-stop tour for your book, Hedi. I guess all of the three things that you mentioned are the things that I kind of want to sort of maybe think about how we might discuss them today. So as you say, like, there's these three kind of central claims that you radically challenge. That's in quote marks because it is a quote in the book, which is, first of all, that Israel flouts international law and human rights. So you say you want to challenge that. Secondly, that law and rights are the remedies for Israel's wrongs. So you want to challenge that. And then that young people, quote, have distinct characteristics and needs inherently different from those of their elders. So that's like the 3 points that you open the book with. And at various places in the book, the second point about law and rights as remedies for Israel's wrongs is summarized as legalism. And the third, about young people having distinct characteristics. And by young people, you mean young humans, i.e. children and teenagers, as essentialism and developmentalism. So, I mean, it's not exactly that on the first two, I exactly disagree with you. But I guess one of the things we might want to talk about in the discussion is like, well, what does that mean though for what we might be able to do to challenge Israel's, the Israeli state's continuing violence against Palestinians, adults and children, if these mechanisms have failed, which, you know, I mean, clearly they have failed, but I'm not sure that their failure is necessarily something that we, you know, that necessarily leads to their abandonment, I guess, in the current global context. So for example, on the first point, that Israel flouts international law and human rights that you want to challenge, I could take your point that the Israeli state, you might say, leverages its signing up to international law and its kind of commitment, so-called, to the UNCRC, that it kind of leverages those to attempt to represent itself as a state, as a kind of normal state in the international system. But I don't think anything in your book really shows that they don't flout international law and human rights. You can say these concepts are, well, you can say that the concept of human rights is in some sense an empty signifier, And you can say that international law is something which clearly in practice is not enforced and has no real mechanism for enforcement unless you're a kind of weak state in the international system of states. But I don't think you can say that they don't actually flout international law and human rights. It doesn't seem to me that your book offers any evidence that they do, as it were, do the opposite of that, which would be to abide by international law and human rights. So I would say that, yeah, they consistently flout both international law and human rights, but they consistently also leverage the fact that they are signatories to various conventions to present themselves as a reasonable, law-abiding state in the international system. And I think actually readers would be very hard pushed to take from the evidence that you offer in the book that the Israeli state does not flout international law and human rights. One thing which I didn't know, and I was like I was very surprised about, was the use of military courts for the trial of Palestinians, both adults and children. And as you say, the kind of, I think this is perhaps a good example of 1 and 2, the kind of the offer of the Israeli state to establish military courts specifically for young offenders was then kind of represented by both the Israeli state and the British government and perhaps the wider international system as a kind of victory for children's rights, when quite clearly the fact that Palestinians are being apprehended by and then tried by military courts is itself something that needs to be completely unpackaged and critiqued. And I think what you're trying to say is, instead of being unpackaged and critiqued, all that happens is it kind of settles into business like a reasonable approach to the Palestinian response to the Israeli occupation. And in fact that you cite one report where the investigators say we are not going to address the question of whether or not military courts are or are not the right venue in which to try Palestinians. But obviously, as you're suggesting in that very quote, clearly this question needs to be addressed, and the use of military courts needs to be condemned and critiqued. So I guess what I mean is, like, yeah, sure, it does for sure, but how do you do that if outside of the framework of international law and human rights? Like, what is the grounds that you offer for your critique? And I guess this is true of so much of critical theory, right? And of critical social justice practices, that we're kind of like, as it were, recruited by precisely the regimes, the mechanisms, the apparatuses that we're attempting to critique, undermine, replace, challenge, and it seems in many ways that this is another representation of that kind of like constant, conundrum, certainly the weakest word I can use for it, but you kind of take my point. And so, I guess what I'm saying is that the wrongs that you describe in the book, it's hard for me to think about how they both things are true. On the one hand, they clearly haven't been addressed through the fact that Israel says that it is a law-abiding state in international law and that respects human rights, and nor has the discourse of human rights managed to in any way really challenge the Israeli state. And it's been remarkably successful in countering the view that it is an apartheid state, or in relation to international law, a rogue state. And I guess that's kind of also relates to me back to the thing about, well, the NGOs, you cite B'Tselem quite a lot, and I, no doubt like you, I think like you, have got a lot of time for B'Tselem. I think they do like excellent work in like exposing the Israeli state and in persisting in their critique of the Israeli state and in persisting in making visible that critique. But yeah, they do it on the grounds of human rights and international law, because that's the grounds on which it, the discourse can be argued. And they deploy children in that discourse in ways that, as you suggest, they're trying to speak to a kind of like global, what can you say, almost like a global common sense that children are the people that we can all agree need protecting, and that therefore and also the people who are innocent in the sense of not culpable. And in that kind of global common sense discourse, organisations are leveraging children in order to try to establish at least one ground on which this very successful attempt of the Israeli state to establish itself as within international law and not a rogue state and not an apartheid state can be challenged. I mean, it actually reminded me a lot of the strategy of like the beginning of the civil rights movement in the US, or not the beginning actually, the kind of attempt to move the movement forward and to successfully challenge it, and the way that children were engaged in that and leveraged by it. And I think this is another point that you want to make, is like, just because organisations leverage children's experience and leverage these ideas does not mean the children that are then involved are in some way like dupes of those organisations that are leveraging these kind of like shared discourses about children and what they need and who they are and what their capacities and vulnerabilities are, right? The other thing that it reminds me of course, is pinkwashing. You know, it's not, children are not the only human rights discourse that is being leveraged by the Israeli state as like, oh yeah, we're signatories to the UNCRC and we're constantly trying to address the securing children's best interest, like as Sarah Schulman describes so effectively in Israel, Palestine and the Queer International, published in 2012. Another way that Israel has succeeded in doing that is representing it as this kind of liberal state, this like homosocial space, this pro-LGBTQ space in the Middle East region. And so you can see like various tactics by which Israel enters into these kind of global discourses and tries to leverage them using the territory of international relations and human rights in order to secure, not that their position ever seems to be insecure, but to secure their kind of like prestige in the international system. So yeah, so law and rights, yeah, have aided Israel in its efforts to subjugate Palestinian minds, bodies and interactions, as you say, and confine Palestinians to this legally enshrined model of childhood that works to their detriment. I can't disagree with that, but and I wouldn't want to disagree with it, but I do kind of want to kind of explore then in our discussion perhaps whether or not that strategy or that tactic is something that then what just needs to be abandoned. Is there another ground on which it can be done? How am I doing for time, Kristen? So I want to make one other point, but
I think you're fine to make another point. Go ahead.
Okay, so I guess my other main point, and actually it's like something which I'm perhaps more in disagreement with, is the claim that you make, which is obviously very familiar in childhood studies, that children are not in any way different kinds of people to adults. So you make the claim quite early on in the book that society in relation to childhood, quote, creates certain physical differences while treating others as meaningless. And that similar realizations about generation and childhood regarding other social groups are widely accepted in gender, sexuality, race and disability studies, which yes, they are, of course. But I don't think the fact that they are accepted in those other spheres means that we automatically can say that it has to be accepted in relation to childhood. And one of the things that you take exception to is the focus of some NGOs, and again you cite partly B'Tselem but other NGOs, on the impacts of the occupation on children, and especially the stolen childhood and trauma discourses. Now, of course, you're right that what you call essentialism and developmentalism are repeatedly deployed to establish a non-negotiable fact about the harm that the occupation, in fact, as you say, quite rightly, the imprisonment really in this kind of like open air prison of the Palestinian non-citizen population has on children. And yes, in doing so, adults, especially men, are eluded to avoid the kind of bad people on both sides that Israel repeatedly deploys. So yes, childhood innocence is the ground on which Palestinians and NGOs are trying to shift the weight of global public opinion towards Palestinian rights to territory. And that same strategy was deployed in apartheid South Africa and, as I mentioned, in civil rights USA. And it may be a tactical error, but it is not, it seems to me, in itself detrimental to the interests of children and youth. So I'm kind of taking exception or disagreeing, really, I guess, with this point about essentialism and developmentalism, or rather the wrong of these ideas. The stolen childhood discourse is double-edged and potentially counter-effective. I don't think childhood can be stolen because it's a life stage of humans, and regardless of how it is experienced, it's still childhood, which is a different point, I think, to yours about stolen childhood. The point is to integrate childhoods that are precarious in whatever way into our understanding of what childhood is, not to evict those young humans who live in difficult or precarious situations or who face violence, from the interpersonal to the structural, from the category of childhood. So I want to argue also, though, that childhood trauma is different to adult trauma, and the evidence, biological and neurological, as well as social, for that difference is significant. I mean, one difference is simply like children's induction, engagement, development of like symbolic thought, and the importance of symbolism, of language, and of cognition to understanding, to live with, to settle oneself with trauma, with loss, with harms. And I think that is different to the experience of adults. And I think there's a weight of evidence that it's different, that childhood studies has almost kind of bracketed it out under this kind of like, it's essentialist, it's developmentalist. It's essentialist in some ways, but here essentialism and developmentalism are just actually, you know, the same, they have the same meaning. It's not essentialist in the way that we can talk about an essentialist gender discourse. It's essentialist in the sense that the idea is that children are developmental in a way that adults aren't. Not to say that adults have stopped developing, but it's a different kind of development. So you recognise that it's documented in the psychological literature, but you assert that trauma and loss are not mere facts, but they're interpretive frameworks, which again, I don't exactly disagree with the fact that they're interpretive frameworks, but they're also real facts. Like trauma is a real harm. And yes, we interpret it differently, we live with it differently, and in a social context where the entire population has repeatedly experienced these kinds of harm, that is going to be a different discourse than an individual that lives in a society that's relatively stable and doesn't expect to experience, let's say, early parental death. It is going to be different. It doesn't mean that it's not different for children to experience parental death than it is for adults. The fact that they're doing it in a context in which many other children are also experiencing parental death also does not mean that we shouldn't attend to the fact that this trauma is different for them as children. And I'm not sure that we need that difference in order to make the argument that you want to make, that children are being leveraged by the Israeli state. Yeah. So anyway, maybe I'll stop there. That's perhaps things we can pick up on in the debate.
Thanks very much, Karen, for your also very provocative comments. I wonder, Hedi, there was a lot there. I wonder if before we move on to Rachel, if you want to take a moment to address this, or would you rather reply to both of them together?
I'm happy to do either, really. I think
we're making good time, so.
Yeah, if we have enough time, maybe I can respond now while everyone remembers what the comments were.
Okay.
So, thank you very much, Karen. A lot to think about here. We seem to both agree about a lot and disagree about some things. And basically, I put down in writing 4 key kind of themes or concerns that arose from what you were saying. So I'll try to address them, but let me know if there's something that, if you want to come back and kind of follow up. Sure. Your second point, in the order that I wrote them, was about whether or not Israel abides by or flouts law and human rights. I think as a lawyer, what lawyers see the more they learn about the law is that actually the question of whether something amounts to abiding by the law or flouting it is just a matter of debate, really. I think each party believes that their interpretation of the law is abiding by the law, and that the other, the opposite party, is flouting the law. So it's more about people's position in relation to the law. And I want to say something more specific about that. But before I do, one of the things that various bodies of critical legal theory argue is that part of the power of the law is that it is so inherently flexible and plastic, even when it seems not to be, even when there's a certain legal principle or provision that seems to be fairly straightforward, because of the nature of the not only the mechanisms of the law, but also the frameworks of law and the language of the law, it is open to these various and competing uses. Now, more specifically, what I do try to show in the book is that it's not only Israel that is kind of manipulating or misusing the law, because then it would have been easier to argue that Israel is just co-opting with bad faith the language of the law. What I also try to show is that some of the reforms, for example, that Israel have passed, have been advocated by pretty much all of the human rights community. Now, for example, in chapter 4, and I've written about this in other contexts, one of the key things I talk about is how Israel now separates Palestinian children and adults in prisons and detention, whereas previously it didn't used to do so, and that was heavily criticized by the human rights community. So we have two camps, both seeming camps, both the human rights community who pushed for these reforms, and then Israel who ended up separating Palestinian children and adults. Now we can say that is not really abiding by the law, which is open to different interpretations because the requirement to separate adults and children has some exceptions and caveats. So it's open to interpretations. But law is nothing without the people who apply and interpret it. And if we have all the actors, including UNICEF, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and many others who are considered the leading interpreters of children's rights, all of them pushing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but I'm not talking about though. I mean, I totally take your point about the separation of adults and children, and especially adults and teenagers, and the loss of opportunities for sharing political, developing political understanding of the situation and the context. Totally support that. I was thinking about more of the other things you described in the book. For example, killing under 12s, and then lying about it. Now you could say, oh yeah, but or indeed, you know, the stuff you talk about, I think it's in chapter 7, where you talk about the way that Israeli soldiers are represented as children when quite clearly they're not, and how this is then used to pass more lenient sentences, for example. I mean, your example there is a good one, you know, of how both the Israeli state and human rights organizations can agree on the separation of adults and children. But there are many other examples in your book where Israel is quite clearly not abided by international law. Indeed, in many ways, its very existence is a repudiation of international
law. Again, I think like you, I'm heavily critical of what Israel does, and I think the book makes that quite evident. I think where our debate now focuses on is the question of legality and illegality. And where do we apply the concept, or to what do we call illegal? So it's a question of where law is. For example, just by means of analogy, in the US, the Guantanamo detention camp has repeatedly been described as a black hole, as a space of lawlessness. But actually what post-colonial and some feminist scholars of international law have argued is that the problem with Guantanamo is exactly the opposite, is that it's hyper-legal, it brims with law. And what I try to show, I completely get your point. And I think you also represent the views of many critics of Israel in this regard. But because I've come to a certain view of the law and of the role that law plays and can play, and I'll say more about that because I know it speaks to your other comment. I don't think it's useful and accurate to say that those things that you mentioned, such as killing children, concealing evidence about it, disregarding accusations. I talk a lot about the culture of impunity. I don't think it's useful to conceptualize them as just flouting international law. And I try to make the case for that in the book. I would say that they're immoral. I would make a political case for how to counter that. But yeah, again, so we can say more about that. I feel like there's more to work with there. I'm not sure we'll reach an agreement, but kind of hopefully we fleshed out the parameters, and I want to leave Rachel enough time to make her comment. So I'll just touch on your other points, Karen, one of which is a very valid question. Okay, so let's say law and human rights, at least the dominant discourses of law and human rights are so bad. Let's grant that. What do we do then? So I'll just say a few things about that. First of all, I think psychologically, I think we need to, I'm afraid to use the verb occupy, but we need to occupy the space of the problem a bit more before we move on to explore alternatives or solutions, because I don't feel like we have a full kind of grasp of what the problem is. And there is I feel like there is an issue sometimes with human rights advocacy and legal scholars and children's rights people. We really want solutions. I think it is important to kind of take some time to kind of explore the problem before we move on to the solution. That's a preliminary point, but I won't kind of avoid your question or escape it. So I think law and human rights, they have pros and cons. I think one of the problems is when they're presented as apolitical, as neutral, and as technical. I think apolitical and neutral, that's clear what I mean by that. By technical, I mean whenever someone argues that there's one interpretation of the law, that's making it appear like a technical and rational instrument, which it isn't. That's, by the way, what both Israel and human rights organizations are doing. And I talk about how they kind of perpetuate similar conceptions of both childhood and the law sometimes. So there are pros and cons. For example, filing a lawsuit can be useful even if you know that you're going to lose, if you think that that lawsuit would lead to the exposure of previously unknown documents. So you're going to lose at court, but there is some supposedly extra legal gain to be had. Often that strategic thinking doesn't take place in terms of assessing the pros and cons of law. And obviously the problem with the law is not confined to using courts. It's also about conceptualizing the problem in legal terms. So I think we do need to be more cognizant of the pros and cons of those frameworks. I think we need to be more overtly political. So for example, you used the term apartheid, which I think is key to understanding the situation. And as you mentioned, B'Tselem, the Israeli NGO, recently started using it, even though Palestinians have been using it for decades. So I think that is a positive development. I think settler colonialism, which some people don't consider to be a legal concept, is key also to understanding the situation. And that is another kind of limitation of the dominant legal framework, because certain concepts are not considered to be part of the framework, both of the framework of analysis and of the valid response. So I think there needs to be an explicit politicization of the issue. And I would also say, and that's kind of taking a step back, that any solution needs to be context specific. And because there are so many different situations there and so many different contexts, I don't have this master plan which is going to solve the entire problem. But I think part of the problem is the lack of context sensitivity. I feel like I've talked a lot. So maybe Kristen, I do have two more points here that I wrote down following Karen's comment, but maybe I can come back to them afterwards, later.
Okay, fair enough. That's already a lot for us to chew on, and yeah, perhaps augur for a next book. But first, why don't we have Rachel give her response, and then maybe you can come back to those comments.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm so pleased that Hedi asked me to comment on the book. I thought it was really groundbreaking, really offered a kind of forensic or clinical precision in terms of dissecting the childhood law rights triad. Although many of the issues were familiar to me, because of this level of forensic detail, I think it provides a really compelling set of arguments, which Hedi has outlined. Although it's contextualized and historicized in Israel, Palestine, the ongoing settler colonialism and state violence and apartheid, I think it offers important insights into that particular context. But as I'm going to go on and talk about, I think it has much broader implications for those of us who are working in the field of critical childhood studies. So I want to pick up on 3 points which sit really nicely with the discussion so far, I think. So the first is, I really appreciated the very granular attention to the way age is made. So as chronology, as appearance, as performance, as ascription, as resistance, but never simply a natural phenomenon. And I think this picks up on Hedi's earlier work where he talks about the way age has become a legal fetishism. And I think what you do here is you unpack the labor that goes into making this seemingly neutral, banal category of age. So why does this matter? I mean, for me, I think it matters in 2 key ways that I read in the book. So one, age acts as a form of power or violence towards its subjects. So for those who are categorized as children, the very easy conflation of innocence, vulnerability, and dependence through developmental logic, or the conflation of risk, aggression, violence, and terrorism with youth, particularly in its intersections with gender and particularly masculinity here. But also, as you point out, Hedi, the ways in which age and the making of the age of childhood also makes a particular form of adult and particular violences that it justifies against adults. So that kind of takes me to the second point around age that I read in the text that I find very helpful, which is the really detailed analysis of how age acts as a very plastic signifier or flexible rationale for violence. So the ways in which the slipperiness of age is used to justify longer sentences, shorter sentences, administrative detainment, food deprivation, or the justification of the bare minimum of food, extreme limits on mobility, and more for Palestinian young people. How age is used as a basis for segregation, which you were just talking about, between younger and older Palestinians who've been incarcerated for their presumed political activity. So in ways which deny intergenerational support, care, sharing, and building of memories, intergenerational memories and resistance. So I think that this is a really kind of important and compelling account of what's happening in Israel-Palestine. But for critical childhood studies, this offers more than just an empirical example of the making of age in a particular place. In part, this is, as Hedi points out, because some of the laws around age are related to their emergence from British colonial law. So we see parallels in other former British colonies. And for me, much of the discussion around age spoke very directly to my own research and activism with unaccompanied children and young people in the United Kingdom. So the ways in which the Home Office assesses age, the sort of violence and suspicion that accompanies that, they're quite punitive and interventionist efforts in this regard, so offering to cover local authority costs in case cases are overturned, and the sort of seeming absurdity of such efforts. So a young person who's been on the move on their own since they were 12 arrives in the UK at 17 and a half or 18 and is assessed as an adult. That, you know, for many young people, their 18th birthday is devastating. It's the age out of systems of supposed care and support from one day to the next, and that many of these cases are lost on appeal. So I think it's not just sort of absurd, though, that there's a very real violence that this produces. So one of the young people that we've spoken to in our research, he said, first they took my age, then they took my nationality. So really kind of existential violence that people experience. Children are placed in adult accommodation and be cut through these age assessment processes if they're assessed as adults. And I think that the point Hedi makes here is also really apropos. It's not that the problem is that adults and children are necessarily placed together. They are not separate islands. We are not separate islands of dislocation that should always be apart. But it's about the abysmal conditions for adult asylum seekers or migrants that is justified simply for the fact that they're constituted as adults. So although my own research sits in a really different context, Hedi's book provided for me methodological insights about the study of age or generation social orders. And I think it contributes to theorizations of age and generation as a powerful social category in which the law in particular is implicated. And I found a very compelling set of arguments about ways to contest lost child narratives, which rely on the essentialized and developmental reifications of childhood, even those that inhabit sort of liberal or tactically well-meaning efforts for the young. A second aspect of the book, which we've all already touched on, and I think that it provides both, again, kind of deep situated insights as well as for the field of childhood studies more broadly, is the discussion of uncertainty in the book and by extension, state violence. So given the plasticity of age, its assessment, decisions that are made and rationalized through it, I think it would be fairly easy or familiar to focus on ambivalence or fluidity of who is this question about who is the child. But what I think Hedi does really brilliantly in the book is to show how this produces a radical uncertainty in many ways, a radical uncertainty for Palestinians, whether through efforts to extend trials as the age of sentencing is what matters rather than when the supposed crime took place, the ways in which renders the future sort of dystopically predictable. So the ways in which home invasions become masked as mapping exercises to conquer uncertainty and predict future terrorists. And at the same time, makes the future impossible for Palestinians to predict due to the absence of fixed sentences and the impact of flexible interpretations of childhood. Palestinian children, young people may never know where they stand. So I think winding through the analysis in the book, we see the sort of banal everyday violence that uncertainty produces. What Hedi narrates as stressful cycles of hope to despair and back again, but as well as spectacular violence. Age is a life and death matter, in Hedi's words, through open fire regulations which permit the targeting of over 14s, or in practice, those younger Palestinians who Israeli shooters perceive to be older or dangerous, and how this intertwines with questions of visibility and invisibility. But one of the things I appreciate that Hedi does in the book, and I think this is one of the points he was just making in response to Karen, is that it's not a book looking for quick and easy solutions. So he's certainly not making an argument, oh, if only we make visible the real child, or if only we make visible the violence of the Israeli state, we can solve the problem. Instead, I think he centers complexity in a very powerful way. He shows the way that recourse, for example, to forms of visibility like video or the testimonies of state agents can actually shore up suspicion of Palestinians' testimonies of violence when they aren't accompanied by these other forms of evidence. So particular forms of visibility cause particular sorts of problems. But the other thing I appreciate in Hedi's account is I don't read complexity as the endpoint. He shows how uncertainty serves as a mode of governance of Palestinian lives, subordinating, punitive, and immobilizing, while it once resisted. And I found myself wondering whether this sort of radical uncertainty that the Israeli state and its violences produce for Palestinian lives, whether those uncertainties might also be understood in their sort of opposite. What else do they produce? So whether these uncertainties for Palestinian, who is a Palestinian child, where do Palestinian young people get tried, what sorts of laws apply, etc. Whether those uncertainties shore up its opposite, the seeming certainty of the Zionist state, the seeming certainty of the law of return for Jewish people and rights to Israeli citizenship, and the seeming certainty of a universality of the sorts of childhoods that the Israeli state and human rights groups are presenting. So I wondered whether there was something useful around thinking about uncertainties opposites. Finally, I think Kristen has said this twice already, but this is a provocative book, and I think you can probably hear that in all of the responses and discussion so far. And for me, I mean this in the best of possible ways, because I think it asks us to think and think differently about questions around settler colonialism in Israel, Palestine, and apartheid, but also what it means in terms of critical childhood studies scholars. So although he doesn't name it as much, Hedi provides a compelling critique of what I think we might call the humanitarian or children's rights industrial complex. So drawing on Angela Davis's formulations of the American prison system as the convergence of actors and interests that profit from the prison industry, Dadisk and Madhu argue there's a humanitarian industrial complex, one with a long colonial history and current practice, where security practices are disguised and presented through humanitarian discourses, as Hedi shows, and where international and national institutions, NGOs, public and private assistance sector accept this logic of legalism, in some cases, as Hedi points out, even applauding Israeli law and citing it as a model worth emulating, but also reduce action or understandings of the problem and the situation as to forms of liberal tolerance. Although Hedi doesn't speak of the industrial or financial side of this humanitarian work or discourses in any great extent, its specter, the specter of finance, the specter of profit is certainly there. And I think this is something I would be interested in hearing more about and understanding more. So beyond the kind of question of donors, which he does talk about, how is it that the political economy of these humanitarian organizations is situated in this kind of tightly interwoven picture that he's painting of the Israeli state and humanitarian actors. So, I think we do see a clear synergy between the state, the Israeli state, its military and legal edifice, and the humanitarian organizations that purport to speak for Palestinian children's rights. Hedi shows the way that humanitarian organizations have supported the age segregation of Palestinian activist prisoners in ways which fundamentally curtail intergenerational care and solidarity, the way they shore up an idealized universal childhood and therefore implicitly justify the violent or dehumanizing treatment of older Palestinians, and the ways in which they silence or erase the knowledges, practices, and perspectives of young Palestinians. Whether this is through using older people as proxies, discounting young people's claims that do not fit their own narratives around childhood innocence, and so on. Again, this speaks very much to context in which I research and am active in, and I think it raises some really important questions for critical scholars of childhood. To my mind, for too long, liberal ideas have dominated, which suggests that broader debates about children's rights have generally been settled by the CRC. I don't think that's what any of us is saying here today, but I think this is a sort of dominant refrain in the childhood studies field. So the argument that's put forth then is that the problem is about putting this into practice and enforcing these rights. And I think Hedi today already, again, has resoundingly unpacked the problematics of such formulations. These are, and I think this is where I kind of am picking up on some of the points that Karen was making around the tactics of such decisions. So in many cases, important active organizations do assert a kind of innocent and therefore deserving non-culpable child through recourse to the language of rights as a tactical decision. As both Hedi and Karen write about, the lonely, sad, traumatized child becomes emblematic of a way to kind of win hearts and minds of donors and supporters. In the field in which I work, it's the legally present rather than the illegal child migrant, or better yet, the British citizen child who it hasn't yet been granted the right to remain, rather than the undocumented or irregular migrant that is viewed as the winning strategy. And so for many organizations, for example, in campaigns, recent campaigns for extending free school meals in the UK, while there was an effort to widen to people with who are undocumented, people with limited leave to remain in the UK who have no recourse to regular welfare benefits. Those who were left out of such efforts were those who are undocumented, and those who were put forward as the kind of emblems of these campaigns were those children who have British citizenship. So I think that there is a danger. In some ways, this is a response to Karen's points. There is a danger that these aren't just sort of tactical decisions to win hearts and minds, but in doing so, this I think can very much write out particular forms of children in childhood who are living in incredibly precarious situations. But I think even more, these such views of winnability wind up narrowing the frame of political discussion to technical questions about who is a child. And trying to prove childness can script advocates and activists into these sort of technical debates about how to mark and separate children from adults, whether this is social ascriptions or biological. So right now in the UK, there's again a debate about whether X-rays should be used to determine whether child migrants, those who claim that they are child migrants, really are child migrants. And it legitimizes a quest for the real child. But even more, and I think this is what Hedi was starting to get at in his previous comments, is that they foreclose the possibilities of deliberating more radical arguments and alternatives. So these sort of tactics wind up in their own reinforcing circle. Even when we think we're doing something tactically, actually then it ends up limiting the ways in which we think and act. It can do that. So to me, what Hedi is doing in this book is what Audra Simpson, the Indigenous North American scholar, what she might call an active refusal, a turning away from the logic of colonial and neoliberal systems of age and occupation, a refusal to use the supposedly tactically efficient categories that will easily evoke sympathy from viewers. Now, Simpson has insisted that refusal is not simply a no or a turning away, but a turning towards something new, much like abolitionist scholars Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore argue. So they argue that the negation of oppressive structures, the ends to colonialism or the prison industrial complex, that these have to be accompanied by dreams and practices of presence. And so they talk about this idea of presence. I think we have some hints in the book from Hedi about what such practices of presence might be. So he talks about the use of meta pictures, which both visibilize what is denied or hidden in state violence, such as Israeli soldiers killing children or invading homes or destroying homes. But also these meta pictures make visible the processes of concealment and make those processes of concealing this evidence at the subject of critical scrutiny. So I think we get some sense here of presence, but I wonder if Hedi might elaborate what sorts of politics of presence might be generated through a turning away from the problematics of children's rights or an effort to reclaim lost childhoods. So in many ways, I end with the question that Karen also posed, which is what do we turn towards, or what is Hedi turning towards? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I think these are also really important questions to review. Hedi, I wonder if you'd like to reply now, perhaps also to the other comments that you said that you had. Maybe there's a synthesis that evolves because Rachel did mention some of the same kinds of issues. So why don't you go ahead and take a little time to reply, and then if people want to start putting other questions into the chat or raising their hand, I'll keep a queue and we'll open it up after Hedi responds.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you both again for reading the book so closely and engaging with it so thoughtfully. Hopefully it's a good read, but it's not a fun read. So thank you for doing that. Maybe I'll start with Rachel's last question, because as you mentioned, Rachel, it's kind of a paraphrasing of one of Karen's questions, which I started addressing, which is, okay, so what politics of presence might be generated if we shift away from, I'm using your terminology, if we shift away from the dominant child rights discourse. I think part of the answer lies in what you were saying, and that is, to me, trying to imagine a politics of intergenerational solidarity rather than divides. So that would be a politics of intergenerational solidarity within Palestinian society, which I think exists, or there are many attempts to do that. And we can see, as you mentioned, and I alluded to that when I briefly touched on the example of Palestinians being separated in prison, supposedly for the best, in the best interest, but actually, as I show in the book, they're harmed by it in various ways, among other reasons, because it severs intergenerational ties. So I think trying to resist that, there's a reason why intergenerational solidarity is particularly important in a context of counter-colonial resistance, or whatever you want to call it. That is particularly important to insist on political continuity, on transferring political knowledge from one generation to another. There is sometimes the risk that if we create shielded spaces for children where they're treated differently and separately than with the best of intentions or not, those ties are broken. And I alluded to kind of indigenous child removal earlier, which I wrote about before, and I touch on that in the book. Obviously, that's very different, because if we think about indigenous child removal, the hope there, or the attempt, was to separate in order to assimilate. In Israel, there's no desire to assimilate at all, on the contrary. But there is certainly a very similar desire to kind of break these ties and create to salvage the young generation and create basically a depoliticized generation. So I think it's important on insisting on that intergenerational dimension, but not only within Palestine, but also beyond Palestine. And that leads me to what I'm trying to do now is trying to respond to you, Rachel, but also trying to kind of tie some of the threads that connect what both of you were saying. So thinking through the intergenerational dimension, I think one of my main concerns, and it comes across hopefully in the book in various ways, is Palestinian Muslim men. I'll just put it more broadly, Muslim men. If we think about imprisoned Palestinians, they are overwhelmingly Muslim men. It is Muslim men who are disproportionately targeted by various forms of military and so-called security violence. And I think intergenerational solidarity means solidarity with these Muslim men. And I insist on Muslim because obviously there's the Islamophobic dimension here, which is not confined to Palestine. And we see it very much at play even here in the UK, obviously with Prevent and so forth. So I think there's a gender dimension there, there's the Islamophobic dimension there, but crucially, what sometimes isn't kind of paid attention to enough, certainly it does in childhood studies to some extent, but not so much beyond, is kind of the need for greater solidarity with these men. Again, I think this can be tied with one of Rachel's comments and one of Karen's comments. So Rachel, you were talking and asking about the political economy of NGOs, the financial side. One of the things I mentioned in the book, I mean, we can perhaps imagine that children's rights organizations would by nature be focused on children. That can be questioned, but that is their mandate. What's interesting is to see how organizations that are not obligated to focus on children nevertheless do that. And there are financial reasons and incentives for that. So one of the things I mentioned in chapter 2, I think, is that B'Tselem, the same Israeli NGO that Karen mentioned, and hopefully people are not getting the impression that that is the only NGO that is mentioned. Actually, I think Defense for Children International Palestine is actually mentioned more, but that Israeli NGO, they publish statistics about their reports annually. And a couple of years ago, they made it public that the 3 most popular reports on their websites had to do with children. Now that, if you're an NGO, that gives a very clear message that if you want to get donations and attention and kind of some traction, it makes sense to focus more on children. There's a financial side to it, and there's a, if you want to call it a PR side to it, or kind of campaigning side to it. So it does make sense from that perspective. It makes sense to focus on children. But what it does, to me, it kind of reminds me of how some advertisers to this day say that it may be best if they had a blonde model, because maybe with the product that they're trying to sell, maybe consumers would react to that more positively. Now, unfortunately, in racist societies, and there are many racist societies, they might be right. So as a tactic, and obviously this is an analogy, not a comparison. An analogy is about 2 fundamentally different contexts, and I'm just showing a parallel. And the parallel to me is about how tactically they might be correct in both contexts. But if I go back, Rachel, to what you were talking about, the political imaginary that forecloses or opens up, I think it certainly kind of reinforces this notion that especially Muslim men are not worth of sufficient representation, sufficient empathy. And it reinforces certain assumptions about deservingness that shouldn't be self-evident. And Karen, again, there's a lot we agree about, but I think sometimes maybe we frame our agreement or our criticism differently. So for example, when you talked about how child trauma is different to adult trauma, and you also talked about how even if trauma is an interpretive framework, it doesn't mean that it's not a fact. So first of all, I do agree that when we have something as an interpretive framework, doesn't mean that it's not a fact. By its sheer force as an interpretive framework, it becomes a social fact that we all experience as something real in terms of...
Okay. It looks like we've come back. You were talking about suffering as a social fact, I believe.
Yeah. So I was saying that these things are both interpretive frameworks and facts. But I think the question of whether childhood trauma is different to adult trauma depends on how we use the terms childhood and adult. A very simplistic example is the question of whether all 17-year-olds experience trauma in a way that is fundamentally different and distinct and uniform compared with how all 18-year-old adults, legally speaking, experience trauma. Because one of the things I try to show is how the term childhood is often applied in context where actually most of the young people concerned are teenagers, and they're lumped together. And we're all familiar with this issue of lumping quote unquote children together, regardless of the context.
Different point, Hedi. It's a different argument. Like to say that people at the fringes of what's socially recognised as adulthood are just more, like that you can legally have sex in the UK when you're 16, that you can work from when you're 13, that you can't vote until you're 18, all this stuff. Sure, but that's different to saying that people, let's say, are under the age of roughly speaking 9 or 10, when their kind of like fluency, if you like, with symbolic systems is generally less kind of coherent or practiced, or even, having a kind of language to express loss and trauma in is different. That's different to saying, well, that's all social construction. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a different argument. It's about like whether or not the materiality of the child's body, which is different to the materiality of the teenager's body, and again to that of the adult at various points. And their engagement with symbolic systems, because of their cognition and their embodied cognition, whether or not that impacts differentially on their experience of trauma, and whether that trauma is in some sense, yeah, harder to bear in some sense.
Yeah, obviously this speaks to a much broader issue. And just to clarify, I'm not trying to deny suffering, and I'm not trying to deny the material aspect of suffering and the positionality, the different positionality of different individuals. I think the interpretive frameworks of trauma combined with childhood leave a lot out, let's just say that, decontextualize a lot. The example I gave, Karen, you're right, is about the fringes of the category, but it's not just about that. It goes much beyond that. It goes about assumptions about universality. So the fact that all 13 years old are comparable in terms of kind of lending themselves to the same, being classified under the same category. And if we don't want to use an example which is about the fringes, about whether, for example, and we do want to talk about materiality and positionality, we can talk about whether a 73-year-old Palestinian woman, about her experience of trauma compared to, say, a 15-year-old male child. So I'm adding a gender dimension. I'm just trying to complicate the story because I think these interpretive frameworks, very well-meaning sometimes, blind us to the complexity of the issues. They're very useful, it appears, because you don't really need to be familiar with the context. When you're told that a child is being traumatized, that's an entire story for everyone, especially if it's, and that's part of the argument, especially if it's an international audience that is not familiar with all the issue. When we know that a child is being traumatized, then nothing much has to be said in order to kind of propel action.
Again, that's clearly not true either. Like, I mean, it's interesting your example at the end, you know, in chapter 7, where you talk about the way that Israeli soldiers get like reconceptualized by the legal system as children, and indeed by public opinion in Israel. And obviously, you know, one's immediately reminded of you know, just this week when a 17-year-old white boy gets let off scot-free for murder, when, you know, Trayvon Martin was like buying sweets and gets killed. Like, clearly, I'm not suggesting that the fact of trauma in and of itself means that the audience are somehow suddenly separated from their, you know, racist, sexist, homophobic kind of like ways of conceptualizing the world, or indeed any ways of conceptualizing the world. No, that's not what I'm suggesting. All I'm trying to insist on is quite simply this, that there is a materiality to the child's experience of the world which exceeds the parameters of social construction. And I think we kind of like in your talk about that, in your book, where you talk about like this is brimming with essentialism and developmentalism, the fact that it brims with those discourses does not mean that those discourses of developmentalism and what it means to experience trauma and, let's say, early parental bereavement as an 8-year-old rather than an 18-year-old, or as a parental bereavement as a 28-year-old, doesn't impact differently on one's life. Subjectivity, sense of self, place in a struggle, all of these things.
I'll just say something briefly because I see that we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to give people a chance if they want to ask something. And I do really want, and I would love to continue this conversation with all of you afterwards. So hopefully we'll get a chance to do that. I think materiality is something that the categories in the binary of child-adult doesn't do justice to. So if we really care about materiality, these are not the concepts we should be using. That's the argument. To say that essentialism and developmentality, as I call them, or developmentalism, as some people would say, is not necessarily problematic. I think what the book does is try to really substantiate the arguments with very specific and concrete examples, where I do hope to show how they do play out in ways that are harmful, especially to the most disempowered people of all ages. So rather than having an abstract discussion about whether essentialism and developmentality are harmful or not, I think the useful thing would be to see how in practice they play out, how they actually impact those that are supposed to benefit from them. And I'll just say, I invite the readers to judge for themselves. But I think both of us, or all of us in this panel, are positioned differently in relation to these languages of mental health and childhood and adulthood. So it just requires a longer conversation that I think this time frame allows.
Okay, thank you, Hedi. There was, before we got cut off, there was a question from Alice in the chat, which was directed primarily at Rachel, but I think maybe either of you could answer, and was, asking at Rachel to clarify your point about uncertainty, and whether you were suggesting, in fact, that the issue of uncertainty can actually act as a benefit, or in some way can benefit Palestinian children, or be used strategically, I think was the question, to benefit Palestinian children in some ways. I don't see Alice here, or she could clarify that question. I'm doing it from memory, so my apologies if I got that wrong. But I see, Alice, you're back in the call. Was that correct? Maybe
yes, Christine, that was the question. I was unsure if Rachel mentioned about the benefit of that uncertainty. Is there a benefit that the Palestinian children get from that uncertainty? And if that was not the suggestion she was making, is there a benefit? And if so, how?
Thank you.
No, my point was drawing on the work of Hedi, was the way uncertainty actually harms, hurts, subordinates, and is used in punitive and very violent ways against Palestinian children. And I think that comes very clearly through the book. My point, or my question, was whether there's a flip side to uncertainty, which is certainty. So if the lives of Palestinian children are produced as so uncertain in this myriad of ways, do other things get shored up as being very clear, certain, unproblematic, taken for granted? So is there something, I was asking Hedi, about the ways in which, for example, the existence of the Zionist state, the law of return for Jewish people from around the world, whether those become more certain in the face of the sorts of uncertainties that are provoked? Not that they are those things, but is there a sort of discursive move and material effect that happens? So slightly different point, Alice.
Can I say something about that?
Yes,
maybe?
please. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you,
question?
Rachel. Yeah, I would certainly say that there's a regime of certainty/uncertainty, as you mentioned. And the book does talk about how uncertainty is produced and what political and legal work it does. But I think the question is, who produces uncertainty and how, under what terms, and for whom? So certainly, creating uncertainty relies on the certainty of some other things, right? The certainty of who has the power to decide, for example, because the decision-making part of what creates uncertainty is the fact that decision-making is very unpredictable and very ad hoc. And that is actually very useful sometimes, as you mentioned, because it constantly puts Palestinians on guard and kind of disempowers and disorientates them. But certainly other certainties. So Palestinians, for both Palestinians and Israelis, so Palestinians know that it's quite certain that they're going to be convicted by Israel if they are prosecuted by a military court. but they are uncertain about, once they are convicted, how long they're going to be in prison, even if they are giving a specific sentence, because as I mentioned in the book, I think, even once a Palestinian spends their sentence, they may be then held under additional, quote unquote, administrative detention, if that is deemed necessary by Israel. So certainty and uncertainty are mutually complementary in how they kind of expand state violence. At the same time, as you say, certainly for other people, there is certainty, right? You mentioned the law of return, which is about how Jews and only Jews are privileged in their entitlement to return, quote unquote, or migrate to Israel, whereas actually Palestinians in the diaspora have no comparable entitlement at all. That is very certain. So there's a reason perhaps, or there's a function that both certainty and uncertainty play, and there's a reason why in some areas we see complete certainty and in others we see an array of uncertainties. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Hedi. I don't see other questions that have come up, and actually we have 2 more minutes. So I guess, we're right on time, and we've actually, filled the conversation up to our ending time. So I wonder if either the conveners would like to maybe say some last few comments before we close.
Sure. Thank you very much. This has been a very provocative and enriching session that has definitely probably left all the audience members turning towards the book now. And we hope that this opportunity will enable some of you who are here to reach out to Hedi, perhaps find other ways to keep the conversation going. And I do want to thank Hedi for, joining CCYSC quite early on as a member, and now taking the lead on, working with us and organizing this book, new book series event, where we have had the opportunity to discuss his book. Kristen, thank you very much for chairing the session. Rachel and Karen, I think both of your comments are very insightful and very, very provocative, and opens new directions, not only for the questions that Hedi has probed in his book, but also for the field at large, where debates around, the materiality of childhood has been seen as a problem figure across contexts in the emergence of the field of childhood studies. So we're turning back to a new way to look at children's lives in the everyday. So thank you everyone for joining, and we will circulate the recording. Sorry for any inconvenience to those who were trying to join through an earlier link and could not join in, but we will share the recording with everyone. Thank you everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at our events next month, and our another session on a new book by R. Maitri in January. Good night and have a good day.